independent panel of my distinguished colleagues from all over this country who have come to this place at this time to investigate allegations of misconduct by the United States Department of Justice generally, and in particular their targeting of black elected officials.
And I think it's bound to become one of the most egregious cases in the harassment and abuse of a black elected official in the history of the United States Justice Department.
And they come in with a bankruptcy claim, a false bankruptcy claim against nonprofit publishing houses and shut them down. What's the First Amendment worth, you know?
You don't get any respect, even if you try to work with them. They manipulate and use you, and when they're finished, they cast you away.
At this particular case, the Justice Department is much worse of a villain than the KGB.
And what Theo said earlier about I love my country, but I'm afraid of my government. Something's very wrong here, people.
On November 17, 1993, the U.S. Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that the U.S. Department of Justice had committed fraud upon the court by falsely and maliciously prosecuting retired auto worker John Demjanjuk, a court decision which finally closed a 17-year ordeal which almost resulted in Demjanjuk's execution. Even more shocking, the same corrupt members of the Justice Department's permanent bureaucracy have been found to be at the center of many other cases in which there is indisputable proof of gross prosecutorial misconduct.
When it came to getting me, it was the same apparatus that I find, in my opinion, was used in these other cases. As in the Frühmenschen case, the Weaver case, the Waco case, the case of Waldheim, the case of Demjanjuk, and other cases, always there's that agency inside the Justice Department which works for contract like a hitman when somebody with the right credentials and passwords walks in and says, we want to get this group of people or we want to get this person. And that until we remove from our system of government a rotten, permanent bureaucracy which acts like contract assassins, using the authority of the justice system to perpetrate assassination, this country is not free, nor anyone in it. And it appears to me that this nest around Mark Richard and Jack Keeney and others in the permanent bureaucracy of the Justice Department, if they're not the heart of the problem, they're close enough to it that if you pull out that cancer, you may find out where the next one is.
On August 31st and September 1st, 1995, a distinguished panel of American legislators and international observers held extraordinary hearings to investigate the Justice Department's politically motivated and illegal targeting of groups and individuals. The panel included Representative William Clark of Alabama, Representative Toby Fitch of North Carolina, Senator Robert Ford of South Carolina, Senator Maggie Wallace Glover of South Carolina, Monsignor Elias L. Hayek of Montreal, Representative John Hilliard of Alabama, Representative Howard Hunter of North Carolina, Representative Ulysses Jones Jr. of Tennessee, and Representative Percy Watson of Mississippi. The hearings were observed by Dr. Kofi Awanor, former ambassador to the United Nations of the Republic of Ghana, Marino El Savif of the Dominican Republic, Dr. Josef McCloshko, former vice premier of the Republic of Czechoslovakia, and noted civil rights leader Amelia Boynton Robinson. The hearings were chaired by former South Carolina Congressman James Mann and by Alabama's most renowned civil rights attorney, J.L. Chestnut. The first day's sessions were largely devoted to one of the ugliest stories in U.S. judicial history, the campaign to harass, entrap, and prosecute every African-American elected official in America.
These prisons are nothing but concentration camps. I know, I've been there. They offer nothing except destruction of the family and demoralization and dehumanizing and de-individualizing the individual who is there.
There was a famous speech by the speaker one day when he declared from the podium that there would never be a day that his grandchildren would go to any school with any of those niggers in South Carolina. Well, personally, after many, many confrontations practically on a daily basis with the Speaker of the House, in 1973, I was charged with failure to file an income tax return, and I was sentenced to 1 year in jail and a $10,000 fine.
I was put in jail for 23 months. I then was given halfway house privileges in Greenville, South Carolina. I was there approximately 30 days, taken out of the halfway house, placed in solitary confinement for 121 days. I could walk 5 steps one way and 11 steps the other, 4 months and a day. I was then sent to the federal prison in Atlanta, Georgia, not the camp, but the prison, there for about 15 days, and I think in that process 3 people were killed. Fortunately, and I received all kinds of threats because I was put in transit with 3 people whom I had sentenced. So the word spread that I had been on the court.
Judge Ferguson has told you about the government trying to set you up with female companionship. They tried to do that to me and to my sweet mate, Representative Faber. Me one day, and after I refused, him the next.
They then went to Las Vegas and got an informant, someone to work for them who had a case in Las Vegas, a man by the name of Stan Bailey, to come to Compton to date me in 1991 to 1992. This is a man I thought loved me. I was supposed to marry him. We were engaged, but he was an informant.
You've been a judge, and you know that the courts are not there, really, to dispense justice.
I agree with that.
They are there to keep in power those in power. That's always been the case. Some judge tell me about, this is a search for the truth. I said, the hell you say? I've been in trials for 35 years. We've never been looking for the truth. In fact, what we've been doing is running from the truth.
After being elected in 1985, I personally was ordered from 1985 until 1992, each year.
And this is one of the things that happened in Mr. LaRouche's case. You have the government shopping for a venue, you know. And when you have no case, you have to resort to tricks and manipulate the system.
I want you all to know that whatever and whenever these proceedings generate, it is something that has never been done before, to tell the story of the African American, and certainly the African American politician. And now the time has come for you to hear from some of us who have suffered the pain, the indignities and humiliations and the destructions of our families, our professions, and our businesses. As a public official in 1982, the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Department, which some of us are familiar with Waco, Texas, and the Branch Davidians, conspired with the Ku Klux Klan to set up and to have me charged with violating the Food Stamp Act of the United States of America. This resulted in a trial which the FBI records reflect that they knew that the Ku Klux Klan had been after me since 1979. I went into the legislature in 1975. I vigorously opposed the death penalty in 1977. And as such, as quoted from some of the redacted areas in this statement from the FBI, the Klan wanted Mitchell out and that he better watch his back. I am proffering this to this institute, to this tribunal, for whatever purpose. In 1994, in my race for lieutenant governor, as I indicated, we were doing quite well. In a statewide race that I was the only black candidate. And after a run off and a poll projection, it showed that I was a very viable candidate to possibly be the next lieutenant governor of South Carolina. I was hit between the eyes with a ton of bricks from something that had happened 6 years prior to this race. A client of mine who had been induced to plead guilty for selling drugs. I had represented him in 1988 in the purchase of some real estate. Not being familiar with the pattern of the federal government, after being told by the purchaser that they would pay the taxes, we did not file Form 8300s, $10,000 or more. Consequently, they reached back and they threatened to charge me and 2 former secretaries with money laundering and conspiracy to commit money laundering. Being the chief lawyer in that office at that time, certainly not wanting my former secretaries to be indicted, and I was told by the United States Attorney that we can indict you. We may not be able to convict you, but we are going to seek an indictment on you and possibly those 2 secretaries. Consequently, we negotiated a plea of misdemeanors to plead to failure to file Form 8300.
Clarification. One point of clarification, I understand.
On your failing to file the form, were you the closing attorney in the purchase of land?
No. I was a closing attorney in 1988 for a 7 installment transaction for a man who bought $154,000 in property. And he made payments. He was to have made the payments to the seller. But ironically, since I closed the loan, he put down $25,000 in cash. And I raised the question, don't you have a check? He said, I keep my money under my mattress. The bank messed me up. Consequently, that was my position to ask him where he got his money. If I had known Joe Willis, the guy in the Ku Klux Klan, was setting me up in 1982, I sure hell wouldn't spend any time with him. But that's the guy who set me up, the Ku Klux Klan. I don't investigate my clients. I don't have the time, neither do I have the inclination. And I certainly don't ask where they got their money. And the money was brought through the office and directly given to the seller. I never touched it. But it came through my office. He didn't pay the taxes. He didn't file the forms. So when they had a chance to hit me with a truckload of bricks, they did.
And you weren't even present when those transactions was done, right?
I wasn't present when 6 of them took place. But I copped the plea.
So Form 8300.
And 8300 is a form which should be filed within 2 weeks after a person has transferred $10,000 or more in cash to the Internal Revenue.
From where to where?
Well, basically, if you handle it. I never handle the money.
You know, I look at you and I look at other African Americans and legislators across the country and say that we could very easily switch roles. I could very easily be sitting there, and I realize that every day that I walk into the legislative chamber and even begin to think about fighting some of this racist legislation that is passing.
In 1993, you were the only African-American chairman of a Senate committee, standing committee, and that committee was correction and penology. One of the things that you was able to do as chairman of the committee was to stop a lot of legislation, mean-spirit legislation, from going on the floor of the Senate. Matter of fact, we killed it in committee. I served on that committee with you along with Senator Glover whenever she get here. One of the things the Republican Party wanted to do in 1994 was to pass those legislation. 2 strikes, 3 strikes, you out, truth in sentence, and all kind of stuff. And so what they did, they stacked the committee. Before you was ousted, they stacked the committee. Something like maybe of the 18-person committee, must have had about, I think, 11 Republicans on it. People like McConnell, who would never, you would never expect to be on that committee if you was chairman. So what happened after they stacked the committee, their plan in 1994 was to pass mean-spirit legislation pertaining to your committee, Correction and Penology. And that was the whole thrust of the 1994 session. So you had to be expelled.
These individual cases and individual things naturally interest us all. But if I had been convicted of a felony, I would have had the opportunity to have had a hearing, to have gone to committees, and to have had the ethics committee to have heard and made a recommendation. Now, this is a felony. I pled to misdemeanors. These were misdemeanors. And I wasn't given due process or equal protection. I was summarily drummed out. I wasn't given the opportunity to be heard. Consequently, had that been, I believe, someone who was of a different color, I don't believe that an effort would have been made to have removed them, notwithstanding the fact that Senator Ford is right. The no parole, and all of this great, tough, mean-spirited legislation which came to our committee, you can see the racial overtones in it. It was just clear, just like a newspaper. So consequently, we put out what was fair legislation, and we resisted and held up that which we felt was inequitable and unfair and certainly mean-spirited. We feel good about our heart. We were told that if we had resigned the chair, we may well not have been expelled, but we feel that we're qualified to be senator, we're qualified to be chairman. Consequently, I was expelled, first in the history of the South Carolina legislature.
I'm glad to see you express the desire or the feeling that it happened to you because you did something. And I guess we all, both Hilliard and Jones and I both looked at it from the same standpoint. You kind of skirted it and dressed it up originally. And I just want to make sure that this record is clear that if you go and you do nothing, you're a good guy. But if you go and you make a ripple in the water, that's where you have the problems.
I was one of three who were the first 3 blacks elected to the South Carolina House since the Reconstruction period. Jim Felder, I.S. Levy Johnson, and I were elected in 1970, and we started serving in January of 1971. Personally, after many, many confrontations practically on a daily basis with the Speaker of the House, in 1973, I was charged with failure to file an income tax return, and I was sentenced to 1 year in jail and a $10,000 fine. In 1974, 13 blacks were elected to the South Carolina House of Representatives. Senator Mitchell was one of those 13. In 1984, well, I resigned from the House when I was sentenced, but I came back to the House in 1982. And in 1984, we got single-member districts to the Senate, and 4 of us were elected at that time. By July of 1990, there were 5 of us blacks in the South Carolina Senate and 16 blacks in the South Carolina House. Several of the members of the House particularly had advanced to key positions of leadership, and there were many others who were close to key positions of leadership. And that was when the explosion came down. 18 legislators were targeted in what has now come to be known as Operation Lost Trust. In the Lost Trust cases, the first to be tried was a black representative, Representative Luther Taylor, who had been arrested and interrogated in a hotel room for 2 days while they plied him with liquor, denied him his right to call a lawyer, and even refused to read him his Miranda rights. At the same time, several high-ranking whites were never even charged. despite having supposedly committed the same crime as the black legislators. In the meantime, 5 of the convictions have been overturned by the Fourth Circuit Court. The original federal judge is now seriously considering the charges of prosecutorial abuse and is in the process of going over boxes of evidence which had been withheld from the defendants at the time of their trials.
I would like, prior to making comments, to give you somewhat of a further backdrop of this whole Operation Lost Trust and at least the African-American members of our state delegation who were involved. And to the person, I think Luther Taylor was first vice chairperson. Luther Taylor was the first one tried. He was first vice chairperson of the education committee. No, I think it was banking committee, banking and insurance, a very, very powerful committee in our state. And Luther apparently had been negotiated out of running for chairperson at some point. And the reason I mentioned that, he was a powerful personality on that committee, and I think would have won the chairperson's election had he been there next time around. You had, of course, at that time, Representative McBride, seated to my extreme left. I think Frank was first vice chairperson of Education Committee. Operations and Management, you had Representative Jim Faber, who's not here, from South Carolina. He was first vice chairperson, I think, of the Agriculture Committee. You had Representative Larry Blandy, who had already acquired enough votes to win a seat on our state Employment Security Commission. Of course, I had was ultimately won a seat on our State Circuit Court from Spartanburg County. That's the highest trial court in our state. And I'm trying to recall, you had Representative B.J. Gordon, who was the ranking Democratic member of the our House Ways and Means Committee. You had Representative Ennis Fant from Greenville, South Carolina, Congressman Mann's County, and of course, Senator Mitchell's County. Representative Fant, in my view, was one of the brightest people whom I saw come to the legislature while I was there. He was the driving force behind putting together an accommodations law in our state, which prior thereto had none. Extremely knowledgeable in the banking and real estate areas. A young man who put together a patent while he worked at one of the chemical companies there in the state that the company later bought from him. Just a dynamic personality. I'm satisfied was well on his way to becoming one of the determining factors in our state, and at 27 years old. And I'm trying to think if I'm leaving out any, of course, from Orangeburg County, you had Representative Ken Bailey. And Ken was a very well-respected member of not only the Black Caucus, but the General Assembly as well. So this wasn't just an arbitrary kind of thing of just going after blacks. It went after blacks who were in decision-making positions and people who were very well poised to become chairmen and chairpersons of important committees. And I think they were one election away from becoming chairpersons. So not only did this Operation Lost Trust take down us numerically, it took down African Americans in that state from a power perspective.
I think that many of the system in South Carolina helped pick out some of the members of the South Carolina Legislative Black Caucus to be targeted in this. And I remember, I think one of my problems that I had, a number of them, was when I first went to the House in January of 1985, a Supreme Court justice retired that was still hearing cases, had made the comment over in Anderson County, South Carolina, after he had sentenced some black boys to 15, 20 years in prison. And he wanted to know what were those niggers protesting outside for. The media picked it up from his mic at the desk, and it was printed in the paper, I read the article that Sunday, and I went in Monday and drafted a resolution up to have him removed, not to hear any more cases in South Carolina. I had that passed. Senator Mitchell picked it up in the Senate, and it was passed in the Senate. That judge has never heard another case in South Carolina. And things like this just snowball, and I really think they keep records on you as it pertains to this. There were 7 criteria for a person to be a target in a federal investigation. And one very important one is a predisposition. And a person has to be predisposed to a crime before you can make him a target. I certainly wasn't, and none of my other colleagues that I know of was. So the government was definitely wrong here in targeting many of us without us being predisposed to a crime. The other thing is, now all 8 African Americans that were targeted and eventually indicted with this pari-mutuel betting bill had been sponsors of this bill for years.
This business of targeting black folk, particularly black officials, goes back to the time we first had black elected officials. It goes all the way back to Reconstruction, which somebody mentioned. In 1985, Ronald Reagan's Justice Department came to Alabama and returned 126 indictments or charges against carefully selected black leaders. Each one was charged with something called vote fraud. I had a meeting with Edwin Meese, who was then the Attorney General of the United States, and asked him what was vote fraud. He didn't know. I didn't know. We raised some money, not much. But then we got our folk together. Those who were charged, we reminded them of what had occurred in Alabama in the 1960s. That they had to be ready to die if necessary, go to jail, whatever. They had to be ready to turn a town inside out, upside down. We had to be prepared to boycott, march, demonstrate, do whatever, and we tried every damn case, every one. And the government won only one. And that one was reversed on appeal on grounds of selective prosecution. And the government refused to retry.
The effect of what they do is so devastating. It's so far-reaching. It destroys our hopes, our dreams, our promises. If this isn't stopped now, because it should have been addressed when Congressman Dimely back in the late 70s, early 80s introduced this to the Black Caucus and into the congressional record, that Operation Frühmenschen was an official policy of the FBI and what it does to people, black people especially. If it would have been addressed then, if black people across this nation, especially black leaders who had been victimized, if they would have put support, put money, because he tried to open a center for harassment against black elected officials, but he couldn't get support. If this would have happened, then these men and myself would not be here today. This would not have happened to us.
Members of the panel, I've been asked to present to you an overview of the case known as the United States of America versus Harold E. Ford. One could say that Congressman Ford's travails began almost immediately upon his upset victory over a very popular Republican congressman, then representing an almost majority African-American district. Fourth case I submit to you, panelists, will be an essay on prosecutorial misconduct. And I think it's bound to become one of the most egregious cases in the harassment and abuse of a black elected official in the history of the United States Justice Department. Congressman Ford, panelists, weathered a 10-year ordeal of government abuse and harassment. The attack first surfaced in 1983 and continued to the 58-count indictment on various bank fraud charges on April 24th of 1987. Then to the first trial on February 12th, 1990, which ended in a mistrial after 22 days of testimony, 29 witnesses, 150 trial exhibits, 110 pages of jury instructions, and 12 hours and 35 minutes of jury deliberations, and several $100,000 by the congressman. The congressman was retried in April of '93 in Jackson, Tennessee, outside his home county and congressional district. In the second trial, he was acquitted of all charges, notwithstanding the government's overwhelming efforts and wasteful spending of several $1 million. Now, without a real case, it was incumbent upon the government to manipulate the system to try to get a conviction. The government's next ploy was to start a media campaign against the congressman about not getting an unbiased jury. This is after they had sought to get a biased jury in the first case by moving the trial to East Tennessee. At the conclusion of the first trial, the government then renewed its effort to get a biased jury again. And with the help of the judge, and I respectfully submit this was a black judge, succeeded in getting a change in venue. So this went again to the Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit.
The government's motion?
Yes, sir, absolutely did. And of course, you know, a lot of us were chagrined by that move, but it did occur, and the Sixth Circuit.
Who appointed it?
Was that a
Bush?
appointment?
Bush?
No, this was appointed by President Carter and
recommended
by Congressman Ford.
You gotta be.
Nope.
Yes, that's what it. And this case, of course, the move was challenged very vigorously. It went back to the Sixth Circuit, and of course, those of you who are attorneys knows that the Sixth Circuit is one of the most conservative circuits in the country, and the move was sanctioned by the Sixth Circuit, and the Supreme Court rejected the appeal. So here we are back for trial again in the second trial. The jury, the case was moved again to Jackson, Tennessee. And this is what I think, and this is one of the things that happened in Mr. LaRouche's case. You have the government shopping for venue, you know. And when you have no case, you have to resort to tricks and manipulate the system. But we get back to the trial in Jackson, Tennessee. And it went on with predominantly white jury. But with a vigorous defense and with the exposure of the government's case, the government didn't even have the witnesses to prove conspiracy. And of course, as Judge Ferguson indicated, conspiracy is a tool that the government is using to abuse black elected officials. But in this case, the alleged co-conspirators were not available, or the government didn't want to risk their presentation. So the case caved in after Congressman Ford had spent several $1 million, and the government had probably spent 10 times as much as he had spent. And so he was finally acquitted of all of the charges against him. And right now, he would perhaps be the highest ranking Democrat in the state of Tennessee.
I want to say here that the record will show that for the last 20 years, Richard Arrington Jr. has been a constant target for prosecution. I happen to believe that much of that prosecution probably was at the hand of our government. I heard the statement today for the first time that I love my country, but I fear my government. I'm afraid I'm going to have to subscribe to that statement.
For the record, Richard Arrington is the black mayor of Birmingham, and he has been subjected to 10 years of intensive investigations by the federal government. A black woman came into my office several years ago, right in the midst of all of these investigations. Her name was Marjorie Peters. And she said that she had been a consultant, as Councilman Bell knows, that she had been a consultant to the city of Birmingham, and that the government had found some fake invoices that she had sent to the city of Birmingham and collected the money on, and there wasn't any question that they could prove it. But they had offered her a deal that she could walk if she would bring down the black mayor of Birmingham. And for some strange reason, she came to me. I would have thought that I would have been the last person but she did come. And I gathered from her having picked me out, she had no intentions of bringing down anybody black. So I said to her, well, we will go to trial. And there was a terrible trial there. The mayor was in contempt of court and sent to federal prison. But Marjorie Peters never cooperated with the government. J.L. Chestnut never cooperated. When I say the government, I'm talking about the Justice Department. Never cooperated with them. The end of all of that was that the government didn't even indict Mayor Arrington, much less convict him. And they had promised Marjorie Peters that she was going to do 200 years. I think that she got about 2-3 years, and that was it. But once again, it required one hell of a fight. Once again, it required that those in power understand that this is not just a fight in the courtroom. It's going to be up and down the streets of Alabama. It's going to invoke boycotts and reminiscence of the 1960s and every damn thing else we can come up with. This is not going to be a situation here where you're going to stomp on us and we're going to say, Yassa boss, no way. And that is the only way we got out of that. Except for that, Dick Arrington would be the ex-mayor of Birmingham.
I saw African Americans in prison. I saw what's done to them. I worked with them. I know what was going on. It's destruction, pure destruction. When these people get out of prison, it's a wonder that any of them has any capacity to survive. Everything is taken away from them. They're being destroyed. 2 years in prison, they've lost their wife. They lost their family. 15 years from now, the children will probably be in some criminal trouble. The wife may get into criminal trouble. The whole community is tainted. Whole communities in this country are tainted by this process, which the brother referred to. But the problem today, what makes the American racist today is not race hatred as such. It's something deeper and more original. It's me. Concern for themselves and willing to throw the other guy in the lifeboat overboard to survive. And they just want an excuse to make it easy to pick out who goes overboard. It's in moral indifference. And there's no cure for this except the one the New Testament provides. Agape, love. If you can inspire people to begin to care and to hope, you can get them to shirk this indifference. And the worst racism, in my experience, is not the guy who was raised with a red neck and a wool hat. The worst racist, remember the Ku Klux Klan, when it recruited under Woodrow Wilson, who was one of the leaders of the recruiting of the Klan, it was recruited largely in places like Wisconsin, Minnesota, Indiana, Ohio, and so forth, Illinois.
Yeah,
So it wasn't rednecks. What was created was indifference was turned into scapegoating of your fellow man. Find somebody to club, find somebody to hate, find a prisoner to execute, find an immigrant to throw out of the country, find a scapegoat. And then some clever swine comes along and says, why don't you pick him for a scapegoat? And out of pure middle-class piggish indifference, you've turned a liberal into a racist. And that's our problem.
Let me just make one other observation. You and I had a little chat in Selma, Alabama, and you were saying to me that, well, I had raised to you about affirmative action. And I think your phrase was that it was a red herring. And I didn't get a chance to say to you that it is a red herring, but whole states are buying it. And for a little black fella sitting off 20% of the population, this government has not been in touch with me since Lyndon Johnson said he wouldn't run again, and I had a lot of reservations about him. But sitting back as a little black fella, and I see entire states marching in lockstep and accepting this red herring as gospel, I guess you can understand that even somebody like me sometimes feel overwhelmed. And whether or not America is just a lost cause, I hate to sound that way, but after 40 years, I got serious reservations about whether we can save this country, about whether this country even wants to be saved.
Well, I take an evangelical view of this. I've been associated with many lost causes in my life, as you have.
Yeah.
And once in a while, we win them. There's no need for somebody begging out in the street to get somebody else's job. There's a lot of work to be done. You just look at the Tom Bigby project and what should have been done to complete that. That'll keep people busy for a long time. You take the American water system. Our aquifers are turning into sewers when they're not going dry because we're not building a water project, which we need. We don't have enough power. We have 20%. When we came out of World War II, there were 60% of us in the labor force were producing material goods. Today, less than 20%. We have coupon clippers, we have unemployed, we have people in prison, but 20% are producing. Our standard of living in the United States today, in physical terms, if you include health care, education, science and technology, plus the things you physically consume, we're half of what we were 25 years ago. We're about that in productivity. This nation is going down the sewer. The world's going down the sewer. We have the means, and government has the means, to turn it around. When enough people in this country stand up on their hind legs and stop voting for what they don't want, or for a result they don't want. And I think that if the problem with people, as I see it, is people don't trust the leadership, and I don't blame them for not trusting their leadership. I blame them for being too pessimistic. And it's up to us and others to get enough people moving to create a movement. Like the case just of Martin Luther King. Now, I never personally met Martin Luther King, but I watched him closely. And I know something about Martin Luther King from people who knew him and his circumstances. And here's a man, who's a good man, he's a preacher, Baptist preacher, I don't know, they run to this way and that way. But one day somebody appointed him, nominated him to be a leader of the civil rights movement, out of a crowd, so to speak. He took the job as an appointee, like a federal appointee, only this was a civil rights movement. He went from crisis to crisis in a few years from the time that he received that appointment until he went to his death, knowing he was facing death. And in that period of time, he made a number of public speeches of great power and pith. Each of those speeches corresponded to a point of crisis in the history of the civil rights movement. And I saw on television, and I read in the recorded speeches, I read a man who had gone into private, into his own Gethsemane, probably inspired by reading the New Testament, and said, I will drink of this cup. And he came out with an idea, with a lot of people swarming around him. But he came out with the idea, and he presented a concept which took a whole people who were looking to him in the civil rights movement, and he ennobled them. He said, you're not fighting for African-American rights, you're fighting for everybody's rights. You're fighting to make the Constitution real. And it was a new idea, a different idea. And as he did with his mountain speech that he gave just before he went, again, a man who had walked into Gethsemane and said, yes, Lord, I will drink of this cup as my Savior before me. And he went out and he drank of the cup, and he inspired people. Now, we don't know who among us is going to be the great leader of this period. But we know, as the civil rights people of the 1960s who had been at the civil rights business for many centuries, in point of fact, many of them of the conscious family tradition, they assembled together. They picked people from their midst as leaders. And among these leaders was Martin Luther King. And I think if enough of us assemble today around these kinds of issues and show the nation that there is something moving, something which is of concern to the average citizen, that from among those we gather, together for that purpose, we will find the leaders we need.
Mrs. Robertson there, as you know, and I did know Martin Luther King. And about a month before Mrs. Robertson then went across that bridge in Selma and changed the world, a delegation of about 7 people, including King, went to visit the president, Mr. Johnson, to ask him to present to the Congress a voting rights bill. And Mr. Johnson said, boys, I just gave you a civil rights bill last year. You can go to the Holiday Inn. Now you can go anywhere I want to go. The country won't stand for 2 civil rights bills in a row. Said, go back home, be quiet. Quiet down. Of course, they didn't. And Mrs. Robertson then went back and went across that bridge. And there was Lyndon Johnson watching all that on the television. And a few days later, there he was before joint session of Congress, presenting what became the 1965 Civil Rights Statute. And he ended, if you remember, he ended that speech with, "We shall overcome." Martin King later told me that he and his wife were watching that on television. And when Lyndon Johnson said that, a little tear rolled down his cheek. And I said to him, well, the little tear rolled down mine, but for different reasons. It may well be that you are no longer the #1 civil rights leader in America. Lyndon is. The same man who 30 days ago said, go back home and be quiet. I just think that racism in America is so much a part of the fabric, so much a part of the history, that it clouds everything. And I don't know how we can honestly even address the very serious concerns that you have and the rest of us have, unless we first try to find some way to grapple directly with this filth that's in the hearts of so many Americans. I'll say this and I'll hush, and I just want to hear your comment about it.
I think what you say is true. I think that nothing can cure that problem except redemption. This is not one of the things that can ebb away easily. It's there. Because people in America still today do not believe that when they look behind the eyes of a human being, there's something there which is divine, a potential for creative reason. And that is the distinction between man and an animal. That people in the United States today tend to be persuaded that their lusts, their appetites, their greed, their pleasure, their personal pain are everything. And everything is physical. And therefore they say, well, if you've got a physical difference, that makes your personality. Because they don't see, when they don't believe in education, when they don't see a baby and say that baby is going to have a classical humanist education to bring out the human divine potential in that little mind, when they say, well, that baby belongs to this race and therefore he shouldn't have that education because he's not going to have that kind of job. He should have a second-grade education or a third-grade education. That when you have a nation that does not see behind the eyes of another human being an essentially beautiful principle which is divine, which partakes of the nature of God, the power of creative reason, you're going to have racism. And therefore, only a nation which gets down on its knees, in a sense, and says, we were about to be destroyed. You think Job had troubles? We've got some real stuff here. And when a nation senses that, how close they are to destruction, and demand redemption, I think that's the only thing that's going to cure them. I don't think anything else will cure it. We can cure it with education over generations, but to cure it now with this nation is an act of redemption.
Kofi Awanor, former ambassador to the United Nations of the Republic of Ghana, Marino El Savif of the Dominican Republic, Dr. Josef Mikloshko, former vice premier of the Republic of Czechoslovakia, and noted civil rights leader Amelia Boynton Robinson. The hearings were chaired by former South Carolina Congressman James Mann and by Alabama's most renowned civil rights attorney, J.L. Chestnut. The first day's sessions were largely devoted to one of the ugliest stories in U.S. judicial history, the campaign to harass, entrap, and prosecute every African-American elected official in America.
These prisons are nothing but concentration camps. I know, I've been there. They offer nothing except destruction of the family and demoralization and dehumanizing and de-individualizing the individual who is there.
There was a famous speech by the speaker one day when he declared from the podium that there would never be a day that his grandchildren would go to any school with any of those niggers in South Carolina.
This is an independent panel of my distinguished colleagues from all over this country who have come to this place at this time to investigate allegations of misconduct by the United States Department of Justice generally, and in particular their targeting of black elected officials.
And I think it's bound to become one of the most egregious cases in the harassment and abuse of a black elected official in the history of the United States Justice Department.
And they come in with a bankruptcy claim, a false bankruptcy claim against nonprofit publishing houses and shut them down. What's the First Amendment worth, you know?
You don't get any respect, even if you try to work with them. They manipulate and use you, and when they're finished, they cast you away.
At this particular case, the Justice Department is much worse of a villain than the KGB.
Well, personally, after many, many confrontations practically on a daily basis with the Speaker of the House, in 1973, I was charged with failure to file an income tax return, and I was sentenced to 1 year in jail and a $10,000 fine.
I was put in jail for 23 months. I then was given halfway house privileges in Greenville, South Carolina. I was there approximately 30 days, taken out of the halfway house, placed in solitary confinement for 121 days. I could walk 5 steps one way and 11 steps the other, 4 months and a day. I was then sent to the federal prison in Atlanta, Georgia, not the camp, but the prison, there for about 15 days, and I think in that process, 3 people were killed. Fortunately, and I received all kinds of threats because I was put in transit with 3 people whom I had sentenced. So the word spread that I had been on the court.
Judge Ferguson has told you about the government trying to set you up with female companionship. They tried to do that to me and to my sweet mate.
And what Theo said earlier about I love my country, but I'm afraid of my government. Something's very wrong here, people.
On November 17, 1993, the U.S. Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that the U.S. Department of Justice had committed fraud upon the court by falsely and maliciously prosecuting retired auto worker John Demjanjuk, a court decision which finally closed a 17-year ordeal which almost resulted in Demjanjuk's execution. Even more shocking, the same corrupt members of the Justice Department's permanent bureaucracy have been found to be at the center of many other cases in which there is indisputable proof of gross prosecutorial misconduct.
When it came to getting me, it was the same apparatus that I find, in my opinion, was used in these other cases. As in the Frühmenschen case, the Weaver case, the Waco case, the case of Waldheim, the case of Demjanjuk, in other cases, always there's that agency inside the Justice Department which works for contract like a hitman when somebody with the right credentials and passwords walks in and says, we want to get this group of people or we want to get this person. And that until we remove from our system of government a rotten, permanent bureaucracy which acts like contract assassins, using the authority of the justice system to perpetrate assassination, this country is not free, nor anyone in it. And it appears to me that this nest around Mark Richard and Jack Keeney and others in the permanent bureaucracy of the Justice Department, if they're not the heart of the problem, they're close enough to it that if you pull out that cancer, you may find out where the next one is.
On August 31st and September 1st, 1995, a distinguished panel of American legislators and international observers held extraordinary hearings to investigate the Justice Department's politically motivated and illegal targeting of groups and individuals. The panel included Representative William Clark of Alabama, Representative Toby Fitch of North Carolina, Senator Robert Ford of South Carolina, Senator Maggie Wallace Glover of South Carolina, Monsignor Elias L. Hayek of Montreal, Representative John Hilliard of Alabama, Representative Howard Hunter of North Carolina, Representative Ulysses Jones Jr. of Tennessee, and Representative Percy Watson of Mississippi. The hearings were observed by Dr. Kofi